Can you explain to me this concept of why it works to foot to a header?
That's a great question, Dave. I've been thinking about it a lot because I think I use it tactically and it kind of works. Like if I need to get in touch with the fleet again or center up and I'm already on the corner, like I don't want to pinch up if I get a lift. I kind of foot out and use that as an excuse to reconnect and then I get a shift and I sometimes I come out pretty well. And I was always wondering if that was that math that did that? Like, is it really faster to foot through a header? Independent of the tactical part of trying to catch back up to the fleet.
Hmm. Um, Prove this to me. How does
Yeah.
how does this work?
Well, you're right. So I had to go back to my high school trigonometry and dig up a few equations I hadn't used a lot, and I use cosine a lot, just so you know.
Oh, better you than me. I'm a
Uh,
man of words. The cosine, that means taking a pen and just signing something, right, with your spouse or whatever. But
that's right.
nothing to do with
Yeah,
angles.
exactly. Exactly. No, that's not cosining. Cosine is, the kind of the math thing. And if you kind of look, I kind of start off with some assumptions like how do you figure out how fast you're actually making it up the course and turn that in the end, I wanted to turn that into boat lengths per minute. Like that's what I can relate to. Like, if am I gaining a boat length a minute? Am I losing a half a boat length a minute? How's it all working out? And so you have to start with VMG. And then I'm going to rip through this because we're not going to actually do the math right here. But, the VMG follows the wind, but how you progress up the course does not, right? So you got to compensate for that. So you got to calculate some distance and convert that in the end to how many boat lengths.
Oy.
And to do that, I kind of did that cosine. And fortunately, in the old days, I'd use a calculator or something. They can do it right in Excel now. So I could just play around with numbers pretty quickly and that's some of them there. And it all comes to this. If, by definition, if you sail at VMG and there's no shift, and then somebody else sails, or suppose somebody's sailing VMG and you decide to sail lower and faster, but you're still not, if that were faster than VMG, that would be the VMG. So by definition, you're working your way up the course slower. So if you sail a little bit faster and lower, so in this case, 5 degrees lower, go a little bit faster, 0.3 out of 5 knots. So 5.3 knots instead of 0.5 knots, you're going to lose about a boat length per minute. So that's kind of by definition.
That's the old reaching around the course, which none of us have ever done, right?
Correct. And so if you're either reaching around the course or you're pinching, you're going to lose if there's no shift. And so the question is, can you use some of this to actually go faster around the course? Well, the answer is yeah.
Thank God.
When you do the math, if you foot that same exact scenario where you go 5.3 knots, but you go instead of five, so you're going a little faster, you're going 5 degrees lower. Well, if you get a 20-degree shift, every minute you're gaining about a half a boat length. Pretty interesting. So the math actually works.
Hmm. Now, let me throw you does the course length come into this? And so we're talking about like, quick, short college style racing versus big open courses. Does the math then become less important versus just kind of managing the fleet in the course?
Well, that's kind of why when I was first doing it, I was trying to figure out like, I was trying to set a distance to weather mark, how far ahead one boat would be versus another, and I ended up going to boat lanes per minute. So, if you're in your little frosty there up there doing your frostbiting, would a half a boat length in a minute, a really shifty venue help you? Maybe not, right? But, certainly over a longer distance, it would accumulate. But then again, so would speed accumulate too. So the relative difference is kind of the same. That's why I go with boat lengths per minute
That
as
makes
my
sense.
standard. So you can decide what you want to do with that once you're sort of there.
And what about the type of boat?
So yeah, the type of boat really kind of matters. So let's kind of skip to that. Like a boat that foots really well. So in this case, if you just go a little lower, 6 degrees instead of 5 degrees, and you go 5.5 knots instead of 5.3, it's surprising how small the break-even shift is. So a break-even shift is if you're going to come out dead even if you foot in that. So you're going below VMG, faster and lower, and you tack. And with a 6-degree shift, you're going to come out even. So that means a 10-degree shift, you're coming out ahead.
Mm.
A 20-degree shift, it would be huge, right? Like you come out way ahead. So the type of boat, but it's more than the type of boat. It's if a condition for that boat makes the boat go faster when you foot.
Mm. Interesting. And go back, let's go back up a couple of slides. I know you,
Sure.
um,
Well, so this is the 20-degree shift is a
mm,
half boat length gain per minute, right?
yep.
So in that condition, I sort of introduced the break-even shift. So if your boat goes in for that condition goes 5.3 knots, a little faster, going a little lower, 5 degrees below VMG, there's a break-even shift of 14 degrees. So a smaller shift, it doesn't work. You get a 10-degree shift, you're losing. But if you get a 20-degree shift, you're doing well. And then you add on top of that, if the boat foots well, then a smaller shift will work. If the boat does not foot well, then it doesn't.
Mm.
So here's a boat that foots poorly. So you just go a little faster, 5.25 knots, and look how small the differences are. They make a big difference. Yeah, and these are all the polars of a boat, right? So if a boat has a flat polar, it foots well. So the top, you can reach or a point and you're going almost the same VMG. Then it works really well. And then a boat that foots poorly, it has a very curved polar. In other words, when you go a little lower, it goes faster, but not enough to make it worth it. So your VMG actually down. So need a pretty big shift to make that work.
Mm. It, is it worth considering the length of the time? I guess the duration of the shift is the better question. I mean, it's one of those things of like, how long do you just keep footing through this uh,
Well, you
header
do
to,
this math, you just
and
foot and go until you
just
get
keep
to the
going?
next shift, and you're going to come out ahead.
Mm.
So that's the bottom line. So it's not like you should have foot at the beginning of the shift. You get a lift, or you get a header, you tack, and it's not like you just foot for a little while, then go back to VMG. If you just do that optimal footing and go fast, you're going to come out ahead.
It sounds so easy.
Well, I think the problem is that I think when we were preparing for this a few weeks ago, when we first talked about it, you said, "Well, what if the shift doesn't come?"
Right.
And my answer was, "Well, then you're going to lose big, right? Like you just footed through, and then maybe it's a persistent shift, and it just got worse, right?" And I think my answer to you at the time was, "Well, if I could figure that out, I'd win a lot more races because that happens, right? Like you assume it's oscillating, but it doesn't oscillate back in time for the windward mark, or it really is a persistent shift and it never comes back.
Mm.
Either way, this kind of screws you, right?
Yeah.
You want to be on the headed tack then. So, or certainly not going to be footing through.
And what
Um,
about as as we're sort of progressing up the course, up the beat, we're getting to the top of the triangle, where you're in the widest part of the course. Obviously, this is becomes much more important than once you get to the apex.
yeah, well, I think, that goes back to the point before that I'd use it more tactically and strategically. When I want to get somewhere, I was using it. I get a nice big lift and I'm already in the left corner. I get a lift on port tack. Like I can almost make the mark or maybe even overstood. I don't put it in the bank, right? Like I kind of use it to get back to center. So I think as you go progress up the course, you might start using it more and more to get that last shift
Mm.
or to find your way out of trouble, out of a corner. I'm like, wow, I'm kind of in this corner and I finally got a little header. I better tack now and foot through it to kind of center up again. Um, so this tells me, the math tells me that not only am I centering up, but I'm actually probably making gains also
Hmm.
on if I hadn't done that. If the guy right next to me didn't do that, I'd come out ahead.
And what about boat on boat stuff? Let's say you're converging, port starboard, and I mean, this might be getting a little granular, and you maybe have a potential cross or an easy cross on port. Let's say you're the port boat, easy cross, but you're in this mindset of, well, I got to kind of keep footing this header, and then all of a sudden you're kind of taking away your tactical play. I guess the question is, at what point does tactics versus this boat speed start to take over sometimes?
Well, it's a really interesting question because, suppose you're barely crossing and you have some time, right? Like you see it coming. You're like, I don't know if I'm crossing that group. You really don't want to be footing through the header then because tactically speaking, you may not cross them. You're going below VMG, so they're gaining on you on the ladder rungs, even though you're gaining leverage compared to where you are, right?
Right.
So I might consider not footing for a little while, get through them, and then refooting again, for example. I mean, the differences are small. So, but if it's a really tight cross, that could make it is going through my mind like, maybe I shouldn't be in foot mode right now. Yeah.
Um, what about then that's strategically with geography and those kind of the elements of the water course? What would be some considerations?
Well, okay. So, what I didn't do in my math was I assumed that the puff would hit at the same time. The shift would hit at the same time, and there was no puff. So suppose I have a break-even scenario, and it's 15 degrees is the break-even shift, right? So I'm in a 15-degree lift. It's a lake, got some shifts, and by my compass, I say I'm a 15-degree lift, but I see ahead kind of a geographic shift, like there's a shift on land, and there's a little more puff there too, or a compression puff or something that's not moving. Well, then I get there first, and that break even now comes ahead to my favor. So strategically, you get there first. If you're trying to get somewhere, footing, and if footing gets you there faster, it actually works. And by the way, so does pinching to a lift. Suppose you see a persistent shift coming for the rest of the leg, and maybe it's the last shift to the mark, and you don't think it'll shift back in time, and you're on a lift. Well, I'm sorry, you're on a header. You don't have the option to tack. So
Right.
maybe you end up pinching through that instead. So doing the opposite kind of works too, although I haven't done the math yet. But we all know that, right? Like we're
Yeah.
like, I see pressure lift above you and stay high for it. Like practically speaking, I do that all the time. My tactician will say that all the time. Stay high for the pressure. And my other thought is, well, shouldn't we tack then to get to it? And they'll say, can't. There's too much traffic, or you're too close to the ley line already. No, I don't want to do that.
Hmm. Something I just thought of. I always kind of come up with random questions for you, right? But one of the things I think we did in a previous episode too about just sort of using gauging off other boats, being aware of other modes of the other boats and whether higher and we say higher and faster, lower and slower.
Right. That's to see if you're in the right mode for VMG. Right.
Yeah, I
Yep.
mean, how do we know if the guy over in a hip is not footing to the header? And
Yeah. Well, so when you're doing the comparison on speed, right? Like if somebody's in a different mode than you, and you really see this in fast boats, right? Boats that plane upwind or something like that, where there is a pretty big range that people might go. Yeah, I think the answer is you don't. But if you're comparing and you don't want to be footing through the header and somebody else is, and you see them going low, you sort of see, hey, they're going. We always do that in boat lanes too, right? So boat lanes forward and boat lanes down. So if they start off two boat lanes ahead and one down, and a little while later they're three boat lanes ahead and two down, that they're sort of reaching down.
Hmm.
But if you do that math real quick, that you're sort of doing okay where you are. Now, if they're going low and faster and they're gaining on you, maybe you do need to put the bow down and get going. So yeah, you do have to say, maybe ask that question, are these guys tactically doing something?
Mm, good point.
You brought up something before about, what boats are this good in, and I sort of thought about that. And it's when you get to that flat polar, which one boat might be have a pretty round polar in some conditions. Like if you're below hull speed in a displacement boat, you get a little puff, for example, or you go a little lower, you actually go quite a bit faster. And so below hull speed, it might work pretty well for a certain boat. And then once your wind picks up 10 knots, you're going 8, 6, 7, whatever your hull speed is, you're not going to go a whole lot faster if you put your bow down, if you're in a displacement boat.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe it kind of works a little bit in below hull speed, but not so much once it gets windy. But then you go the other way around, maybe a planing boat's the opposite. So you get to some magical wind speed of 12 knots, and all of a sudden it pops on a plane if you put the bow down. Well, maybe it works really well then, because you put the bow down, you get to that next puff and pressure first, and it kind of, you know, connect the dots in that thing.
Mm. On the 2.0 on this real quick, because I know that you're big about communicating on your boat. Presuming we're in a crude boat of 4 or 5 people. You got a tactician,
Sure.
a lot of stuff. You maybe speak to yourself as well. What's kind of the communication on your boat that you would do to kind of once your mindset goes or your tactician says, we're going to foot to the header here. How do you set the boat up, the sails, kind of just quickly walk through shifting modes to sail these different angles?
Right. So, and by the way, this holds for whether you're doing this to foot to a header or to foot out from underneath the boat, or,
Mhm.
I actually find I end up pinching more than I end up footing because it usually impractical because you end up footing into people, right?
Mhm.
Like if you foot too much, you're just going to run into somebody's dirty air. So you end up holding higher than you want. But either way, the communication and the trim ideas are the same. I always think of footing as a little bit twistier, and the pointing is a little flatter sail and a little bit tighter leach. So by a flatter sail, your entry angle changes, right? It gets flatter so you can point harder, you're sheeting harder, your boom goes up, and you might even feather a little bit if you have to, like the windward ticks on the jib luff will start to flutter. But yeah, there's sort of, we do have a language and what we do automatically for point mode versus foot mode versus VMG. And it's always a little twisty, and for fast forward for footing. And this is a good point, because we worked on this a lot when I was coaching for the Olympic stuff. The idea was to set up 3 boats, and you would go for like a 3-minute drill on a tune, have the windward boat point, and the middle boat be VMG, and the leeward boat practice footing. And then after 3 minutes, the leeward boat would tack, then the middle boat would tack, and then the windward boat tack, and then you'd know how you did relative to each other.
Hmm.
So you'd start to fine tune how much twist do you need? Do you drop the trab a little bit or not? And there's all those little fine tune things. Like maybe you can heel more if you're footing, but you have to be super flat when you're pointing because you need all the lift you can get. And we worked on all those little things. But that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, point being, it's not just all about the angles, which are obviously important, but it's matching the sails to the angles you're trying to sail as you change.
Yeah, and one thing I learned from doing the math, if I went in and I changed it from 5.3 to 5.35 knots, so you're going 0.05 more knots, it pretty radically changed the wind angle, the shift that it
Right.
took. So if you went just 0.05 faster, the break even might be like 7 degrees different on the shift or something.
Hmm.
Like I was really surprised. And that told me that you got to get really good at footing to make this work. Like you might say, oh, this doesn't work. And that's just because you're terrible at footing.
It's
You
not a
get
skill
good
they
at
teach you
footing,
in
and all of a
junior
sudden it
sailing, is it?
works.
Yeah. Cool.
You
So
know,
now that you've done the math, has it changed some of the thinking that you may apply for your next regatta? I mean, or is it just more validated what you already knew?
I think a little of both. The validation of using it tactically, for sure, is the main reason I was using it. So I would use it to, get out of the corner to kind of match up with center up or to center up with the fleet or the course. And I always wondered if it really was helping via, get me up the course faster. And now that I kind of know that it is, I might even do it even if I'm going to do it more, even if I'm not using it tactically. So I
Hmm.
guess the answer to your question is strategically, I plan to use it more.
Hmm.
Use it more to play shifts and be really confident to use it to get somewhere. So I get a little lift and I'm kind of thinking there's some wind on the right, get to the right, I'll get there first or sooner than I would have, and it doubles the gain.
It's hard to dispute the data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the
Unless
other
the
thing I'm
data's
going to do
bad.
a
Yeah.
little, I'm sorry, say again.
I said, unless the data's bad, right? Yeah.
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 Well, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about whatever boat I'm sailing a little more on when it might not work. How big a shift do I need if I'm sailing a J70 in light wind versus heavy wind? If I'm sailing a pure displacement boat and it's overpowered, I might use it less. I'm already at hull speed.
Hmm.
So I think I'm going to be a little more conscious that, hey, it's not one size fits all for every boat and for every condition.